fortunate to have with us today David Cortright, who is the Director of Policy Studies at the Kroc Institute for Peace, International Peace at Notre Dame University, and also Chair of the Board of the Fourth Freedom Forum. David is the author or editor of 17 books. He's written very widely about issues of peace and security. His most recent book is Ending Obama's War. And David has done some excellent research and worked on a report called Afghan Women Speak, where he interviewed a number of women in Afghanistan, and I think is going to provide us with some very interesting information about what the conditions are for women in Afghanistan and how we can move forward to a sustainable peace and how women are an essential part of that. And I also, Adzim, just wanted to highlight that I'm getting a little bit of background noise, and so if there's something that we can do, I don't know whether it's working badly for other people, but as we move forward. But I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to David to get started.
Okay, thank you, Kathy, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. And we're presenting information today on our Afghan Women Speak report, which is on the next slide. And this is an update of the study that we did about 1.5 years ago, and it's now being updated. So as the slide comes up, it'll show you the title page. And we, as Kathy mentioned, have conducted research in Kabul, myself and also my colleague Sarah Smiles-Persinger. And what we want to do today is go over the information in the report, and in particular to provide some updated information, because we were quite impressed to learn in the last few months as we did the research how the progress that women have achieved over the last decade is continuing, and there's some significant further advances, while at the same time deepening risks and jeopardy for women as well. And this issue of the human rights of women is, of course, critical to the debate on the war in Afghanistan. And as the NATO summit has made the decision to turn over security responsibility to the Afghan forces by 2014 and to withdraw most foreign forces by 2014, the urgency of addressing the condition of women and human rights in Afghanistan has increased. So we want to try to present our overview of this, but making clear as we go along that the concern for human rights of women in Afghanistan is certainly not an excuse for continuing a senseless war and the killing that's going on in Afghanistan, and that the war must end. But as we'll outline as we go along here, we think there are ways in which it can end while the U.S. continues to support the programs that have worked to advance the socioeconomic rights of Afghan women. So in the next slide, we talk about the social and political rights of women. And on that slide, you can see that with the new constitution that was adopted after the overthrow of the Taliban, under Article 22, women have full legal equality and voting rights. And as you know, in the Afghan parliament, 25% of the seats are reserved for women. And there is a Ministry of Women's Affairs and a national action plan for women's rights in Afghanistan. We hope that there will soon be a similar national action plan for women in the United States in terms of our government policy. So these are significant advances that Afghan women have achieved. Although we have to recognize that while these rights exist on paper, in reality, they are jeopardized, and the ability of women to participate politically has been diminishing over the last few years. The public space for women is more at risk over the last few years. And the reasons for that are twofold from what we were told in Afghanistan. One is that the insurgency is stronger than ever, and the Taliban control more of the countryside, and they are able to impose more restrictions on women as they did when they were in power. And secondly, even within the Kabul government that the United States is supporting, that our taxes are supporting, there has been a strong reactionary tendency. Many of the warlords and strongmen who are dominant around the country are in that parliament, and some of their attitudes towards women's rights are no better than those of the Taliban. But nonetheless, at least de jure, women do have certain important legal and political rights. Now, the next slide, we focus on the social-economic condition of women in Afghanistan. And as that slide comes up, you can see that there have been very significant improvements, especially in education, in healthcare, and in the ability of women to participate in local economic development. And we'll talk about each in order. With education, this has been a huge priority of the Afghan government and of the international donors who have been supporting Afghanistan over the last 10 years. And as a result of this substantial social and economic development funding, access to educational opportunities has significantly expanded, as the figures show. Right after the Taliban were overthrown, only 900,000 students in school, all men, all boys, and now 8.4 million are enrolled, 39% female. This is an amazing and quite significant improvement in access to education, quite unprecedented in terms of world development progress. And it's been made possible by the financial support from donor states, from the United Nations, from the European Union, World Bank, and other agencies. It's a result of effective social development policy. But even with these numbers, we have to recognize that these numbers represent primary education only, and the opportunities for secondary and especially advanced education are quite limited still for both boys and girls in Afghanistan. But nonetheless, real improvements, and as we'll keep emphasizing as we go along, these are improvements that we hope can be sustained even as the war ends and as the U.S. withdraws its forces, its military forces, but hopefully can sustain its funding for workable, proven social development programs. Next slide is on the healthcare situation in Afghanistan and the improved access of women to healthcare. So in this next slide, you can see this image of women in receiving healthcare and their babies. And we know that Afghanistan is one of the least developed countries in the world, and it has had the highest maternal mortality rates and infant and child mortality rates in the world. Over the last 10 years, however, there's been a concerted effort to invest in healthcare and especially in opportunities for mothers. And so you can see here that the number of trained health workers and midwives has increased substantially over the last decade. And the midwives figure is particularly important because it provides, of course, attendance at birth, which you can see here. The numbers have increased dramatically. And because of the traditional culture in Afghanistan, only women can attend other women medically. And so many of these midwives are women, so it's not only improved health care, but additional occupational opportunities. And as a result of these improvements, we've seen significant drops in child mortality rates and in maternal mortality rates in Afghanistan. Now, I should caution that these numbers and statistics about health care access in Afghanistan are irregular. They come from different sources. There's wild variation in these numbers. But the numbers we're using here come from a major national health survey that was conducted with rigorous scientific methodologies, and it seems to be the most reliable source for the information on access to healthcare. But however you look at it, there's an unmistakable improvement in access to healthcare for women and for all civilians in Afghanistan over the last decade. And again, this is a substantial social development funding that has come from donor states, from USAID, and from other governments and agencies. The next slide deals with local economic development. And in this slide, you can see that we are speaking about primarily the National Solidarity Program. And all analysts have agreed that this is one of the most effective programs in Afghanistan. It's primarily a microfinance program in which the funding is provided to locally selected community development councils, much like the kind of community development councils we have in the United States and exist in many countries. These programs are providing opportunities for local handicrafts, local development projects, and in these local councils, the latest figures show that they include 35% female participation. This is significant. This is primarily a rural-based program, and it indicates that women are gaining additional opportunities to participate in the social and economic life of their communities through this National Solidarity Program. And again, this is substantially supported by international donors, and it's a program that must be sustained as we continue to draw down the troops and try to end this war in terms of international military involvement. So all of this together, I think, suggests, as our title today indicates, that there has been progress, especially in the social development realm. But the big problems in Afghanistan are in the realm of security, and the next slide and the several after focus on the problems of security in Afghanistan. Because it's obvious that the war is going very badly, and the numbers of civilians who've been killed are actually, as the next slide indicates, the next part of the slide indicates, the numbers of civilians as tracked by the United Nations office in Afghanistan have been increasing, more than 3,000 last year. The numbers this year are still high, and of course we won't know until the end of the year. So while our leaders are telling us that there have been improvements in security, the fact is that the security situation is dismal, and the numbers of Afghans who are dying have been increasing, not decreasing. And when I traveled to Afghanistan in October, when you get there, it's a long trip, you're jet lagged, and you get a security briefing. And one of the things they tell you in the security briefing is how bleak the overall condition is. Now this slide is on the Pakistan side, but it indicates, as the color code suggests, that the Taliban insurgency has substantial influence all across northern Pakistan. And this, of course, is a predominantly Pashtun region in the country, the same ethnic group from which the Taliban in Afghanistan emerged. And it means that there is a vast sanctuary and support base for the insurgency all across northern Pakistan. It's constantly being used. There's a constant flow of insurgents and militants, armed actors across this border. And despite all the effort that the U.S. has provided over the years, there's no way to control the flow of the people and weapons and armed actors across those borders. So that's one of the fundamental dimensions of the security dilemma in Afghanistan. Now the next slide has a similar chart on the Afghan side of the border. And when I arrived in Afghanistan in October, our trip, the agency that I was working with brought us to an obligatory security briefing. When you get there, no matter how jet lagged and bleary-eyed you are, you're required to go through this briefing. And when you do, it quickly snaps you to attention, because what we were told was that most of the country is dominated by the Taliban and the insurgents. And the agency that I was with, Court Aid, the large humanitarian agency, they're based in Kabul, but they said, well, we're not able to travel beyond the city by car, and very rarely can we go out. And even though we have projects out in the provinces, we pretty much have to rely on our local Afghan partners. And when we have to go out to one of the other cities, we fly out rather than drive. So the situation is extremely bleak. We asked, well, how many insurgents are there? And we got different numbers, but the average was about 20,000. So there are 20,000 armed military at any one time actively fighting U.S. forces. There's an article in today's USA Today newspaper indicating that the numbers of road bombs that are being planted in Afghanistan is continuing to go up. So the insurgency is stronger than ever. And remember that General David Cortright himself, commanding general, said in 2010, General Cortright said that we're up against a, quote, industrial strength insurgency. And if anything, that insurgency has gotten stronger. So there is absolutely no way that this war can be won on a military basis. And that's why WAND and Women Without War and many of the coalitions that have been working for peace and justice over the years have been strongly urging that the United States has to end this war, that we need to withdraw our troops and to try to bring about a peaceful settlement in Afghanistan. But as I say, everyone who is honest about the situation recognizes that there cannot be a military solution, and that the longer we pursue this war, the more it seems to strengthen the insurgency and the more it undermines the security of the Afghan people, including Afghan women. So our last slide outlines some of the thinking that we've tried to develop over the years in terms of what could be a strategy for ending the war in a responsible fashion. In my latest book, Ending Obama's War, that's the sort of the subtitle, Responsible Military Withdrawal from Afghanistan. Just to pull out and head for the exits without trying to assist the people of Afghanistan is not a responsible or effective human rights strategy, I would argue. And many would say that it perhaps is immoral in terms of the obligation that we have to the Afghan people to try to clean up the mess that we've created through our prolonged war and military occupation. But I'll talk through a few of these points quickly here, and then we can open it up for your questions and after Kathy's concluding remarks. Obviously, the top priority is to withdraw foreign military forces, and thankfully we are starting to see some reduction of U.S. forces. This summer there'll be another 20,000 or so U.S. troops withdrawn, and I believe from the President's schedule that we'll have something like 65,000 or so troops there in the fall, and the numbers will continue to go down gradually to 2014. And most of the troops from the NATO forces will also be gone by 2014. Although I am concerned about the fact that the U.S. seems to be intending to keep a residual, so-called residual military force in Afghanistan beyond 2014. And I think that's unworkable and a dangerous policy. And as long as foreign forces are in Afghanistan, this provides a boost to the insurgents. Because we were told over and over again by the experts that we talked to, by the women that we interviewed in Afghanistan, that it's the presence of foreign forces that is one of the driving factors in the insurgency. So if we try to stay there militarily, try to impose our will on Afghanistan politically and militarily, it will only mean continued insurgency and war. So that's the first and most important requirement. Second is that as we withdraw militarily, we need to engage politically and diplomatically to assist the Afghan parties to try to come up with a political solution. And again, we've heard from President Obama and other political leaders and from Karzai, President Karzai in Kabul, that a political solution is necessary. And there have been some halting efforts to begin preliminary talks, but nothing has materialized yet. And in fact, as we speak today, there are no negotiations, no political talks underway, either from the Afghan government side or from the insurgency side or from the U.S. And obviously, unless there is a negotiation, unless there is a political process, we won't see an end to the war. So it should be a top priority of the U.S. government and of our NATO allies and of the United Nations to facilitate and encourage a political dialogue among the parties in Afghanistan to try to achieve an end to the war, to get a ceasefire in place. Obviously, that would be the first and most important step, and then through a series of confidence-building measures to try to work out a political arrangement. And no doubt it will mean, at the end of the day, if there is an honest negotiation, that some power sharing will be necessary between the mostly Tajik-dominated government of Kabul and the Pashtun Taliban power that exists in most of the rural parts of the country, and especially in the south and in the east of Afghanistan. But it's not in the place of the United States to dictate what that solution should be. It has to be up to the parties. And one of the points that we've been emphasizing within the WAND project is that any peace process, any political dialogue that gets underway, as it must, should include women and civil society actors in Afghanistan, and including especially the women members of parliament. As I noted earlier, 25% of the members of the parliament are women, and these women are gaining political experience and have much to say and have a legitimate voice that needs to be heard as a political reconciliation and power sharing process gets underway. So it's critically important that as the U.S. withdraws, we use our diminishing influence over the situation in Afghanistan to encourage the participation of civil society and of women in the Afghan government and in parliament to be part of this peace process. A third factor here is the need for a diplomatic arrangement among Afghanistan's neighbors, and especially Pakistan, because as I indicated, Pakistan has been a major support base of the insurgency. The Pakistan army and government have been supporting the insurgents, and there will not be a peace unless Pakistan is a party to it. And of course, India is also crucial, Tajikistan, China, and other neighboring states. As part of a diplomatic process, we've encouraged the consideration of an interim protection force or a peacekeeping force that could be deployed as all the foreign troops are leaving, that might be under the authority of the United Nations Security Council, but that would have an independent command structure and hopefully could include a substantial number of troops from Muslim countries, so that it might have a higher degree of acceptance among the Afghan parties on the ground. This idea is frankly not widely understood or accepted by most international policymakers. When we present it to officials at the UN and elsewhere, we usually get blank stares. But we know from the empirical research about other peace agreements and other wars that the presence of an international peacekeeping force supported by a major international peace mission is critically necessary to the chances for success for sustainable peace. The statistical data on this is quite overwhelming. When there is an international peacekeeping force and peace mission, the chances of success are like 90% greater than when there is no international protection force. So if we want to have any chance for a peaceful solution in Afghanistan, a major international presence and possibly a peacekeeping force will be necessary. And then lastly, the need to sustain, as I've indicated several times, the effective social development funding support that has been provided over the past decade to sustain these gains in economic development and in social opportunity for Afghan women and for all civilians. There is a tendency, as you know, when nations withdraw from a war militarily, they tend to also reduce their social economic funding. And already we've seen some of this from some of our NATO allies. If we were to do that, it would be a tragedy, a terrible disservice, and a slap in the face of the Afghan women that we've tried to support over the past decade. So we need to really make it a priority as we interact with our legislative representatives, as we talk with our neighbors, that the United States, as we withdraw militarily, which is necessary, that we need to sustain the funding for these social development programs so that the gains that have been achieved can be preserved. So it's a tough agenda to try to present politically in this country nowadays, but I think it's important that we have a principled approach. We need to end the war, but as we do so, we need to support a peace process. We need to ensure that women play a central role in that peace process, and that we in the United States, with our allies and other countries, donor states, provide continued support for social and economic development. So thank you for that, and I'll now turn it back to Kathy.
Actually, before Kathy gets on, I just want to thank you very much, David, for your presentation and for spending this time with us today. And I just wanted to remind all of our attendees that your phones will be muted. And while Kathy is doing the wrap-up, I encourage you to submit any questions you may have for David using the question feature on your attendee panel. And when Kathy finishes, we'll ask David your questions. All right, now I'll turn it over to Kathy.
Thank you, Etsy, and thank you again, David. This is a great presentation, and hopefully it's also stimulating some of you to think about what you can do to help us to pursue this agenda and to create a more sustainable peace in Afghanistan and make sure that women are at the table both in peacemaking and in peace building. And WAN does a lot of our work with Congress, and so one of the focuses that we have is really trying to influence members of Congress to promote this kind of sound policy. And as David, I think, mentioned a couple times, we're in a difficult environment right now. The one positive is that there seems to be a growing trend towards actually ending the war, and even it's starting to percolate up through members of Congress. But we have seen a little bit of a pushback even on that and wanting to try to keep even more troops than what the administration has said. So our first order of business is really continuing the pressure on Congress to make sure that we begin to end this war. And as David said, along with that, there needs to be some commitment to engaging in the peace process. We know that the military solution doesn't exist, that it hasn't existed for a long time, and yet we keep trying with increased drone strikes and night raids and all of that. So we need to end that, and in its place, we must begin to move forward with creating some negotiations and a reconciliation process, a peace process. And then the other piece of this is supporting the funding for development and the kinds of diplomacy that are needed. And this is a struggle that we find in our budget overall. And when we're looking at what our budget priorities are and how we pursue security, we're spending 56% of our discretionary budget on the Pentagon and on that kind of military tool, and only a very minor fraction of our discretionary budget, about 5%, on all of our foreign aid and diplomacy. As the overall budget, of course, it's less than 2%. And we really think that that overall needs to be changed, but particularly when we're looking at Afghanistan, we think that there is an opportunity here that it would be devastating if we lost, to really continue to push forward the gains that women have made, and to do that with investment in peace. So we've spent an awful lot of money, a ridiculous amount of deficit spending on the war to make war, and it hasn't been effective. And we will compound that by not spending some more investment in the effort to fund development and promote peace in Afghanistan. So that is kind of our overall message. We're looking for opportunities coming up this summer and fall, and would like you to stay tuned to WAND and our website and our action list. We will send you those opportunities when there are votes on these issues coming up. We also have a curriculum that we've developed for you to use in meeting with your friends and neighbors at home over dinner. We have developed a curriculum that includes a little Jeopardy quiz and some activities for sending letters to members of Congress. And we are upgrading it to add some film content from community-supported films looking at women in Afghanistan. And we also have this material from David and the Kroc Institute's report. So if you'd be interested in doing that, we would love to have you contact us, and we will send you follow-up information about how to do that. And now I hope you've had time to develop lots of great questions, and I'm going to let go ahead and manage that process.
Thank you, Kathy. We actually do have a lot of good questions. Our first one is from Catherine Emanuel, and Catherine asks, how are women in Afghanistan being empowered to be a part of social and political growth? And what can be done to move beyond the blank stares of engaging Muslims to be part of the neutral peacekeeping effort?
Right. Well, very good question. I mean, we met quite a number of the women who are indeed playing a significant role. One of the most important groups is the Afghan Women's Network, and they do receive support from international government donors, but also from some private foundations in the U.S. And they are actively involved in trying to improve the opportunities for women in Afghanistan. You've probably heard of and read about the controversy over shelters for women, and some of the reactionaries in Parliament are trying to shut down shelters that are available for women who are trying to escape abuse at home or in the public square. And Afghan Women's Network has been playing a role in trying to support that effort, just one example of many others. They also are playing a role in ensuring that women have a place in the conferences and international meetings that are held about Afghanistan. For example, they sent a delegation here to Chicago for the NATO summit, and they presented a statement that had been carefully developed in Afghanistan through consultations with women in dozens of communities all around the country, developed a carefully crafted statement summarizing the opinions and the views of many hundreds of Afghan women from all over the country, and then brought that to the NATO summit. They are very much involved, and the idea of giving women a seat at the table and empowering women as part of the process would certainly mean that groups like the Afghan Women's Network should be part of that process, should be consulted, should be there at the table as the decisions are being made. I mean, the question about Islam and our Islamic phobic perspectives in the United States is a big one and a difficult issue. And we're seeing that not only in the U.S. but also in European countries and other parts of the world. And we have to counter that whenever we can. That these wars are not a product of Islam. Those who claim to be fighting a war in the name of Islam are actually subverting the religion, just as extreme Christians or extreme Jews would be doing the same in terms of their ideologies. Religion in its best form, a force for benevolence, for love, for charity, for helping others, and we should constantly remind people that Islam, if you read the actual text of the Quran and the other sacred verses, is filled with a strong message of compassion and love and respect for others and discipline and humility. So we should always, I think, speak out against those who demonize Islam, who believe that all Muslims are somehow our enemies. we need to welcome the many Muslims who are here in the United States who are playing such a constructive role and help our fellow Americans recognize that these issues are not about Islam, but about how to bring justice and how to overcome the conditions, the economic and social conditions that give rise to these armed conflicts.
Thank you, David. Our next question is from Savage. Lisa asks, delegates from around the world are supposed to meet in Tokyo July 2nd through 8th to discuss the way forward in Afghanistan. What do you know about women's participation in these talks, and who are the participants?
Yeah, good question. This is the summit that's going to be focusing on development funding. But also, unfortunately, the way development funding is being interpreted by the allies, it's also about funding the Afghan National Armed Forces and Security Forces. Sadly, much more money is being devoted to funding these very large security forces in Afghanistan than to sustaining the economic and social development programs that we've been talking about here today. The numbers are staggering. This $3 or $4 billion a year has been pledged by the United States and Japan and other governments to sustain these very large securities in Afghanistan, whereas we don't have firm commitments yet in terms of the smaller amounts. We're talking about probably a couple $100 million max for all of the social development programs put together. It's a critical summit that's coming up in Tokyo. It's not getting much attention in the U.S., but in some respects it could be more important to the future of Afghanistan than the NATO summit. So if we can, we need to call attention to these distorted priorities that Kathy talked about earlier. So far in Afghanistan, more than 90% of the funding that the U.S. has put in has been for military purposes and has gone through the Pentagon. And unfortunately, even with this development funding conference, it looks like that pattern is going to continue in terms of supporting the Afghan security forces. Obviously, Afghanistan needs some security forces, but not the vast scale that we've established. We now have more than 300,000 Afghan army troops and police funded through the U.S. and other donor states. And that's far beyond what a very poor country like Afghanistan can sustain. So that's a critical question that needs to be addressed. And I haven't checked in terms of the participation of women at the Tokyo summit, but I suspect that the pattern will be similar to what we've seen in the other big conferences. There was the conference in Bonn in December of this past year, and earlier conferences in London. And at every one of these conferences, a similar pattern emerges. The initial list that comes out from the Kabul government is pretty much all men. And then groups like Afghan Women's Network begin to raise a concern. Thankfully, often Secretary of State Clinton supports those concerns, and the U.S. state will second the concern that women from Afghanistan should be part of these delegations, some of our European allies as well. And then usually some percentage of the delegates end up from the women's organizations and include some women members of parliament. So as I say, I don't have the exact numbers yet in terms of what the delegations will look like in Tokyo, but I think we'll probably see a similar pattern that most of the Afghan representatives will be men, and a few women will be there to try to get their voices heard.
Okay, our next question is from Caitlin Worm. Caitlin says, when women gain the right to vote in the United States, they were first more conservative and often voted as their husbands did. Politically, do you see any patterns like this in Afghanistan so far? How does putting women in these positions of power actually work in practice in Afghanistan?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I meant to address it along the way. When we talk to the women members of parliament and to other political observers and even some of the representatives of the Ministry for Women's Affairs, they recognized that many of these women are in the parliament because they were placed there by men. and they represent the interests of some of these power brokers, the warlords, the strong men who dominate in many of the local communities. And I don't think it's fair to say that they represent women's interests per se, or at least most of them. And even when you ask women, their attitudes about voting, the idea that they should follow the advice of their husbands or men in the family is fairly commonly accepted. So that, it's a very conservative political culture. These traditions are deeply rooted, and it's going to take a lot of time before attitudes evolve to the point where the women political representatives can see themselves as truly representing. Some do already. I don't mean to suggest otherwise, but it's not the universal situation among the women in the Afghan parliament. But still, I think my own view, maybe others of you would have a different view, is even if you have initially a situation where the women who come into these political positions are not able to fully represent women's interests, it's important for them to be there. They begin to show the men in the parliament that they can also speak effectively. They have an important voice to present in these debates. And then women learn political experience. They gain an understanding of how the legislative process works. And all of that, I think, is over the long run helpful to begin the broader political empowerment of women that can only benefit Afghan society.
Great. Our next question is from Allison Mullenbeck. Allison asks, what strategies have been used to effectively engage women to increase space for to effectively engage men to increase space for women in the peace process?
Yeah, that's another good question. It came up quite a bit when I was over there in Kabul. A number of the women said, well, what are we doing to work on the men? Because they are the problem. And these misogynist, very reactionary views towards women are quite prevalent, especially among many of the elders and the religious mullahs and the local councils that have a big role in making decisions at the local level in Afghanistan. And these are also the heart of the Sharia system, where most civil disputes and legal issues about property are settled by these local councils in which men and religious elders play the dominant role. Well, there are some efforts under the National Action Plan that came from the Kabul government with support from USAID and the U.S. State Department. There is an effort to try to educate more broadly in the society about the benefits of women participating in political life and how women should be equal, and how within Islamic teaching and in the Quran there are many verses that talk about how women are the equal of men and how the rights of women should be respected. So the attempt to try to educate people in Afghanistan about the necessity and the legitimacy of women playing a greater role. Unfortunately, the National Action Plan in Afghanistan has not really been able to have much money to disseminate these kinds of messages. One of the things we talked about in our Afghan Women Speak report is that ideally the U.S. and other donor states should provide to the Afghan government to do television advertising, to perhaps create television programs in which women play more of a role, to try to build the broader public social awareness about the legitimate role of women in public life. So there are those kind of things that I believe would, over time, help to kind of break down some of these reactionary traditional messages. Just one other thought on that. I think in some ways these social economic development programs may also be helping. I heard an international radio broadcast about a year ago about the health programs and the midwife support programs that have been, as I mentioned earlier, quite successful. And they were interviewing an elder in a local community. And he said, this is all through a translator, he admitted that when the midwife schools were being set up and health workers were starting to show up in the village, he was quite confused and alienated by this. It was not the traditional way. But he had to admit that to see the mothers being able to deliver their children and be healthy, and that the babies would be healthy, and that the mother and the baby would survive, was a good thing. Certainly, they had to recognize that having mothers and children healthier and not having mothers, so many mothers die in childbirth, is a positive thing. And perhaps this is also a way in which attitudes will slowly change, and there will be a greater recognition of the importance of women in society and the advancement of women's position and the protection of women in health issues and their opportunities and education and all the rest, that this will begin to change social attitudes. But these attitudes, as I say, are deeply ingrained, and we know that you can't change a culture from outside. You can't change it through military force. It can only grow from within, and we can encourage and try to help the process from external basis, but ultimately it'll have to flow from within the country itself.
Okay, I think we have time for just one more question. And our last question is from Cinda Arsenault. Cinda asks, is it realistic to lobby for removal of troops from Afghanistan when it is clear that there are a large number of insurgents on both sides of the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, and Pakistan houses nuclear weapons?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I think the withdrawal of troops is already happening, and what we'll see is, the U.S. is attempting to keep some residual force there, but my guess is that that will not be tenable. If we have 100,000 troops there and cannot diminish the insurgency, we're certainly not going to do it with whatever the number ends up being, 15,000, 20,000. So there is no military solution, and that's what we've said all along, and what even the generals and our political leaders recognize. Yes, the insurgency is huge, and it has a major influence not only in Afghanistan but in northern Pakistan. I think the only answer can be to try to seek a political solution. And the factors that have been driving this insurgency from all the reports that we've seen are two primarily. One is the presence of and the behavior of the foreign troops, A, and B, the corruption and the lack of representation within the Afghan government. And that's where a political solution will really be important. Ultimately, there'll need to be some political power accorded to the Pashtun community and to those who are part of the Taliban insurgency. It's the only way these kind of wars come to an end. Politically, that'll mean challenges, certainly, for the rights of women. But it doesn't mean that the game is over and that the struggle, it means the struggle will continue, and women will have to continue to fight for their rights in a new government, a new coalition, as they've had to under the Kabul regime that we've been supporting. And again, the Afghan security forces, as I mentioned, they're up over 300,000 now. They need to diminish, but they are substantial. And most of the people that I talked to over there, and I've seen in most of the reports, there's no one that I've read expects that the Taliban are going to march into Kabul and take over the government. That's not going to happen. And there are those Afghan government security forces able to protect at least the government itself. So they will have to negotiate and reach some kind of compromise as well. And the solution is not going to be pretty, probably, in terms of what it looks like for the Afghan government. But in terms of what we can do in the United States to try to influence the situation, we've not had much influence to begin with. That's diminished. Most of the impact that we've created, frankly, has been negative in terms of the security side, the military side. The more troops we put in, the stronger the insurgency tends to become. Now, the insurgency will probably strengthen as we withdraw because, they see victory potentially within sight. And when we leave, they will claim victory. But as I say, the Afghan government, the Kabul government, will still be there, probably, and some kind of political solution will have to be negotiated. And this is another reason why an international peace mission is so urgently necessary, if we just allow the parties in Afghanistan to fight this out and struggle over this in 2014 and 2015, it's likely to be very risky, and the chance of a civil war, a full-scale civil war breaking out, are significant. I heard this from a number of parties in Kabul, that there are many people fearing civil war, including many of the women. But the solution is not to keep our troops there. That's not going to help over the long run. So we've got to find these political solutions, and hope that this can be achieved through in a process that allows the women to have a voice, have a role, and so that their rights can be protected and they can continue to fight for their rights into the future.
Well, thank you so much, David, and thank you to everyone who joined us for this webinar. We appreciate you taking the time, and David, all the great information you shared with us. Just wanted to remind everyone that you will be receiving a follow-up survey after this webinar, and we really encourage you to send us your feedback so that we can continue to do the kind of webinars that you find helpful and informative. And we'll also be sending you some follow-up information with information from David's presentation and links to resources on the WAND website, and also an invitation to sign up for WAND's mailing list if you're interested in hearing more about the work we're doing on Afghanistan and more about what's happening in Congress. So again, thank you very much, and with that, we will end the webinar.